afternoon. My name is Lee Francoeur. Welcome to Ohhh Canada, presented today by Eagle Law Group. Today on Ohhh Canada, we're going to have our special guest, Tappy Killebuk. We're also going to have the show Inconvenient Truth and end with Road to Reconciliation. First, I want to introduce myself and explain what we're going to be doing with Ohhh Canada. Ohhh Canada, I'm hoping, is going to become a forum for high-level Indigenous issues within Canada and try to expose some of the assimilationist, colonization, discrimination that exists within Canada against First Nations. Hopefully with a backdrop towards reconciliation and how we're going to get over this hurdle of having Indigenous and non-Indigenous work together in a future that is free of discrimination and hope for everybody. It's going to be a daunting task. I hope the viewers will enjoy this journey. First, I'd like to introduce my special guest today, Tappy Killebuk. Tappy, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you.
So Tappy, tell us a little bit about your role. You work with In From the Cold. Can you tell us a little bit about what your role is?
Sure. I'm the manager of Indigenous Relations at In From the Cold. I don't really have a mandate or a job description because when it comes to Indigenous issues and people, and then just overrepresentation of Indigenous people, there isn't a limit to where they are overrepresented. So I try to empower, or it's limitless. So I try and do as much as I can to support the individual to integrate into community with all of the healthy supports that they need.
Right.
Yeah.
So tell me, in your role there, how do you, in the theme of Indigenous poverty, how do you find nationally in Canada and more specifically in Calgary and Alberta, Indigenous populations are related with respect to wealth and poverty?
Well, just to speak to the population that I see at In From the Cold, 60% of our population that stays at shelter are Indigenous. So whether that, and usually they're from the Treaty 7 area, so from the neighboring First Nations. And with my understanding of working with these people, they don't have enough space on reserves.
Right.
Because there isn't enough housing on reserves. There's also no jobs on reserves. So people are trying to come to Calgary for a fresh start, but they don't have the resources to get a home immediately, so they end up in the shelter.
Right. So the reason I wanted you on the show today, Tappy, is because what you're showing is so consistent with what I believe that is not only happening in southern Alberta, but all across Canada. We have great overrepresentation from First Nations in all aspects of poverty, including health, education, the criminal justice system, in poor areas, reserves without water. And then flipping, we also have a great underrepresentation of First Nations in what you would call like higher level business ownership. Although this is starting through great work from organizations like the CCAB, the Canada Council for Aboriginal Business, we're starting to see some movement. But it's so slow and it's just so painful. My view on this is that we cannot go much past this conversation than our residential schools.
Right.
What's your experience with residential schools and the work you do?
I have worked with people who who their parents have gone to residential school or their grandparents have gone to residential school. And I try to relate to them on that because my own mother is a residential school survivor.
As was mine. My mother was too.
So, and I understand the implications of what has happened to my mom. Not personally, because I haven't been able to have that conversation with her, but from like just my learnings in the Western style of school, and then just observing the people that I serve. It's just the trauma is still there.
Right.
And the trauma, we haven't been able to start healing. Not everybody. I luckily have. I've been working on my healing journey for a long time, but I've been able to be in that position where I can, that safe space to heal.
Right.
I think a lot of Canadians don't understand that all of this is still fairly new. Like 2008 is when Harper apologized, but Indigenous people have not been given the time to grieve either in all of this.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up the apology in 2008, and that's kudos to Prime Minister Harper, a conservative, right-wing Prime Minister.
Yeah.
But it was the right thing to do. I'm not sure we've resonated with all of Canada about how impactful that apology was, what it actually meant, how it symbolized. In my mind, the residential school experience symbolized exactly how the great theft of Indian lands and resources occurred. Yeah. There was direct quotes. The best way to get the Indian off the land is take the child away from the Indian, separate those families,
yeah.
and cause this distress and this lack. Our people are very oral and culturally influenced from generation to generation. As soon as you had that violent, dramatic interruption in that transfer of knowledge and pride,
yeah.
and replaced it with shame,
yeah.
it devastated communities from coast to coast to coast for a purpose.
Yeah.
The purpose was the taking away of the lands and resources from Indigenous people. I bet you most Canadians don't even understand that there were some 150,000 children that were taken, that we have 80,000 living survivors, that there were 132 schools across Canada. The last one closed as late as 1996.
Yeah.
All of this resulted in over 6,000 deaths.
Yeah.
Statistically, you were more likely to die going to a residential school than you were fighting in World War II.
Yeah.
Can you believe that?
No. But yes, I can.
Right. And so through this experience, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who wrote a report and tried to provide the last word for Canadians to appreciate and understand the dramatic impact that this has caused and devastated a whole group of people. Mm-hmm. Among other things, I want to raise the issue that in my mind is front and foremost for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was the linkage in the TRC Call to Action 43. The Commission draws a linkage to the United Nations Declaration. And as you know, the United Nations Declaration for Indigenous Peoples speaks to the absolute wrong internationally that white cultures have imposed on Indigenous communities worldwide. Mm-hmm. On the basis of discrimination and only on cultural superiority and taking away without consent Indigenous people's rights. Mm-hmm. The United Nations Declaration says that is absolutely unacceptable. This was only passed as recently as 2007. The rest of the world passed this document except for Canada, mm-hmm. the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Again, colonizing countries with a big stake to make sure Indigenous people don't have their fair access to power.
Yeah.
Only as recently as May in 2016 has Canada finally supported the United Nations Declaration. Only 3 years ago, Canada said, yeah, you know what, you're right. Indians have some title and ownership to their territories. Isn't that astounding? Even after, this is after the apology. So they apologized and said, sorry, we did all that, but we're still not going to acknowledge that you have any stake or right to any resources.
Mm-hmm. And that's amazing. Like, I've heard all of that information before, but I still don't see the results. Like, where are the results? Like, where is the money going? Where are our resources? Why can't we have? It's still eminent that we are still being overrepresented or underrepresented.
And the reason colonially
Yes.
within Canada, in my view, is because there's not a proper respect shown to the Indigenous people. Let me read you Article 2 of the United Nations Declaration, which is the root of the title and ownership that Indigenous peoples have. Article 2 says, Indigenous people and individuals are free and equal to all other peoples and individuals, and have the right to be free from any kind of discrimination in the exercise of their rights, in particular that based on their indigenous origin or identity. Yeah. So it's saying anything that's based on the color of my skin or and any discrimination, it's not acceptable to take away rights. If I, as a white person that received an inheritance, the color of my skin does not matter. It's that origin and your history and that ability to no one else would accept that if they were my grandparents and were hoodwinked, we're in BC, so we don't have treaty, but hoodwinked out of our lands and resources, I think anybody would be as furious as I am that their rights are just on the basis of legislation, the Indian Act, that called Indians not full people. We've seen this in North America. We see it with the United States in slavery, and in South Africa. It's a little known fact that South Africa actually borrowed that model from Canada. Yeah. The Indian Act was the model by which South Africa said we can go into an indigenous territory, call them not full people, and take over their lands. Isn't that unreal?
It's disgusting.
If the viewers have some time, I don't want to dive too deep into this, but the United Nations declarations, especially Articles 21 and 22, they really speak to this connection and this how it is just atrocious that any government will go into an indigenous community and not recognize that there is true owners. Let me just quickly divert back to the Royal Proclamation and the whole idea that our history is abundant with examples of this, he who speaks with forked tongue. Yeah. On the one hand, Indians are good enough to sign treaties and give lands to non-Indigenous people, but they're not good enough where they can say, wait a sec, when we say we're going to share, we're not just giving it to you and we're not giving away all of our rights. There's a whole bunch of trickery. And there's a bunch of trickery on even the interpretation of the treaties. Yes. The treaties were interpreted by people who didn't understand English, who were paid for by Canada, all to the end of trying to trick Indigenous people out of not sharing, but somehow signing and giving away. Yes. So please spend some time, review the United Nations Declaration. If you have any doubts about the idea that Indigenous people are the same as non-Indigenous people, you need to get familiar with this document.
To say on that, I think it's only an 18-page document, but then the United Declaration also printed a how to take these recommendations and use them, just like that. So how to implement the rights. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much. Tappy, appreciate you coming on the show today. For our viewers, I'd encourage you again to look at the United Nations Declaration. I also want to have you watch for our next episode. In that show, I want to go through what economic reconciliation is going to look like with respect to now what. We can't just continue, Tappy, to complain and suggest that there is not a path forward. So we're hopefully on this show, I'd love to have you back, and hopefully we can talk about a way that Indigenous and non-Indigenous can work towards reconciliation in the future.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Ohhhh Canada, and thanks for joining us, Tappy. In this segment, what I want to do is talk about an inconvenient truth. Tappy, in my work as a lawyer and in my work with the University of Calgary, I'm a professor at the Faculty of Law, and economic reconciliation is my obsession.
Okay.
Let's see if we can put up the matrix that we've developed at the University of Calgary, and I've done it in conjunction with Joanna Jimenez Pardue, a law student that works with me, but also a law student at the University of Ottawa. We've been developing this matrix that speaks to the idea that Indigenous people, as you highlighted in your work from from the Cold, are overrepresented in poverty, yet underrepresented in wealth.
Yes.
And for me, it's such a travesty and a shameful view of our history that we must fix. If you look at the graphic, if you have wealth being one aspect and you have time along the bottom being another, over time, my contention is that Indigenous people went from a position of wealth to a position of great poverty.
Right.
Non-Indigenous people, however, on the other hand, came in from Ireland as potato farmers with nothing but a hope and a promise that when they got to Canada finally, they were going to be able to prosper, work, and get some wealth.
Right.
So after the Royal Proclamation, there were a whole bunch of European people from Ireland and everywhere else that came to North America and sought land directly from Indigenous people. Because they were international peoples recognized, they were able to do that.
Yeah.
However, King George thought through his Royal Proclamation, we got to stop this. If Indians are able to sell directly to non-Indigenous people their lands and resources, we're going to be left out. So the proclamation says no more, the only land that can be purchased from Indians is Her Majesty through treaties and otherwise.
Right.
And so for a period of time, that relationship worked well. It was a case where through the fur trades and everything else, Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people both prospered. In my estimation, the horrible event was Confederation in 1867.
Yeah.
Her Majesty, Queen, gave all authority over the Dominion to Canada.
Right.
Canada immediately, within a year, implemented their first Indian Act with a view of implementing discriminatory laws against First Nations. Are you aware of some of these laws? The early ones?
Yes.
Can you tell our viewers some examples of the atrocious legal obstacles that Indigenous people had to endure just as existing as human beings?
Well, I understand that they were placed on reserves and that they could not leave the reserve, that there are Indian agents to ensure that they can't leave the reserve. What I understand is that you couldn't become a lawyer, you could not vote, you could not go to school without giving up your status. But that's pretty much, and then of course Indian residential schools.
So in the residential schools, in no small way was a huge dramatic impact.
Right.
It taught my mother, I don't know your mother's experience, I suspect is going to not be a great one.
Yeah.
My mother's experience was all of the stereotypes.
Yes.
It was you were pagans, you were dirty. My mom was one of those ones that remembers wanting to wash the brown off her in the showers because the nuns told her that it was just her shame and that made her dirty.
Yeah, of course.
And her religion, their religions were illegal.
Yeah.
And so everything that was meant to unite and keep those bonds moving forward were specifically and intentionally squashed.
Yes.
The government of Indian Affairs was set up so that the department was set up to as efficiently, i.e. the lowest cost per human being, administer the lowest level of medical, education, health, any kind of standard was sent. Much like farmers who with cattle on a reserve, how do we as cheaply, in most cases these residential schools were slave camps that were farming for non-Indigenous people around those communities. It was incredibly horrific conditions. And so in my view, after 1867, when Canada became a country, poverty was specifically and intentionally incurred on First Nations. There are some big points, especially around 1910, where there was international wars happening, and 1930s and 1940s, Great Depressions, causing scores and scores of people to come over to Canada to escape everything. And the government used that as a mechanism to open up all these lands for settlement. Yes. So it's only been the last 100 years of intense, great settlement that has really taken away my grandfather and my family's right to inherit our lands, just like, right. And so I'm always to this idea of, how is that fair? How is it the case? So when everyone says, well, that was so long ago, like, why can't we just get over it and why can't we move forward? I say this, look, the treaties are only, less than 200 years, 100 and some years old. Yeah. And if they're not being honored, then I say, well, what are we going to do? If we're going to keep interpreting treaties or recognizing Indigenous rights in a way that only keeps everyone in poverty, then what are we striving towards? Poverty was just rampantly imposed on First Nations until 1982. Tapi, in 1982, you're probably aware, Indigenous peoples' inherent rights were recognized in the Constitution. Yeah. And now, because we have the capacity to get lawyers, there has been some movement upwards. Yes. The problem with reconciliation is this huge disparity between the poverty First Nations are under right now and the great wealth that everyone else is enjoying. Yeah. Is that we're unable to figure out, what does it look like? What is reconciliation? Is it stealing wealth from white privileged people and giving it to Indigenous people and meeting in the middle? Is it trying to figure out how to get Indigenous people to be on the very top end of the wealth spectrum? Mm-hmm. It has to be something. Right now, the measure, Justin Trudeau aspires to get clean drinking water for every Indigenous person in Canada. Yeah. Tell me, Tapi, how is reconciliation to have clean drinking water for every Indigenous person in Canada? I'm sure in from the cold, clean drinking water is probably an issue, but how is it that we're relating Indigenous people to that level of poverty?
I honestly just can't. I couldn't imagine. I've never lived on a reserve with a boil advisory. I just don't see, why is that something that we are still fighting for one? It's been I know some reserves have had a boil advisory for 20 years. I know that Justin Trudeau has committed to doing that. to change that, but still hasn't. And he's been in office for 4 years.
Since 2016.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So 3 years.
Yes.
And I know that it still hasn't happened. I honestly still don't understand. And I'm looking for the answers. Like who are responsible? Who is responsible to get all of this done?
Right.
Yeah.
So Tappy, we're in this dilemma right now. We have great poverty. You and I discussed off camera about in contrast to the great poverty that we have Indigenous people, somehow our political spectrum in Canada is still leading us to the right. Alberta just elected a right-wing provincial premier. I think we're moving towards a right-wing federal government. So in a backdrop where we're trying to say, how are we going to find a way to bring First Nations into the discussion about economic reconciliation? These right-wing governments are geared to continue to give the top 1% the most of the wealth.
Right.
And so how are we going to distribute wealth to the bottom 1% where our communities are overrepresented?
And I think that we're not, like us Indigenous people, we are not incompetent of everything. We have, like you and I, we have gone to school and we have learned things. We understand how the world works. You are a political scientist. You know what should be done and what shouldn't be done. I think there should be proper consultation. There should be equitable resources need to be distributed to the Indigenous communities. That includes the First Nations, the Inuit as well. I really feel like there needs to be proper consultation too, and I'm not sure, I can't remember if I already said that, but like we are experts because we've lived this way for a very long time. And I think I feel like we're still being underrepresented in federal governments, in provincial governments, and municipal governments.
Thank you very much. That's our episode of Ohhh Canada for today. In closing, I just want to remind our viewers to check out the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. Check out the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Especially those teachers out there, educators, including law societies, law professions. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has said that those of us who hold the public trust of knowledge for our future generations must become aware of the travesties of oppression and colonization that's occurred, and make sure that our kids moving forward have this appreciation, because I don't believe that we're getting the message through. If we have any hope of moving forward towards reconciliation, it's going to be by spreading this truth and having everyone have empathy, sympathy, and move forward cooperatively towards an Ohhh Canada that we can all love. Thank you.